The Sydney Opera House, how would you paint this? Would you go tight? Would you go loose? So in this video, I'm going to be demonstrating both techniques, painting tight around the Opera House, painting the Opera House in a tight style, but then going back to my more loose style for the rest of the painting. Hello, my name is Tim Wilmot, a watercolor painter, and I create watercolor tutorials, videos up here on YouTube, and also I have a on site where I've got a vibrant watercolor community, and also I run watercolor demonstrations and workshops. Please go to my website timwilmot.com for more details. So the subject of this video is the Sydney Opera House, that iconic building, fantastic building, and this photograph was very kindly shared with me by one of my Patreons, Bronwyn. So Bronwyn, thank you very much indeed for sharing this photograph, and a slightly unusual view of the Opera House. If you do a search for the Opera House, as you zoom in, you can just begin to see the cladding on these concrete shells of this lovely building. Let me just zoom back out again. But not a normal view here, but I quite like this because I immediately was attracted to this light edge here of the ferry boat against the darker background, and then this lighter building, which looks a little bit sort of out of place, as indeed this modern building here. But it's a nice contrast of these straight edges against, we've got this beautiful sort of elliptical curve. They're going to be quite tricky to draw those in and paint them in. But the contrast of those two straight edges, all of these straighter edges here, quite pleasing to try and attempt that. But yes, a mixture of painting tight and painting loose. When I say tight, for those that are not familiar with that term, so it's being quite detailed and precise, and taking time to represent accurately the object that you're painting. And then the sort of opposite to that is painting loose, where you're being a little bit more free with your painting style, a bit more relaxed, if you like, a bit more impressionistic, just providing the impression of the objects that you're painting, maybe actually not doing it in a slow, labored way, but really trying to create the essence of that object. So I'm going to be, in this video, I'm going to be painting quite tight. Unusual for me for the Opera House. Unusual for me painting in that tight style. If you've seen any of my other videos, you'll see that I paint in a slightly loose, impressionistic way. But service will be resumed on the rest of the painting. So in this video, I'm going to go through all of the different stages of the painting, discussing this photograph here. First of all, the actual subject for the demo, and then the different painting stages I go through. First of all, the drawing. It's going to be very important to do a drawing with this. I need to get precise, these curves, these beautiful elliptical curves of the cantilevered shells of the Opera House here, and then getting the composition right as well with that drawing. And then I'll be laying down a wash. I'll be going through the wash technique used for the sky and these shells here as well. I'll be going through next my darks, adding in some darker values to the painting to give it depth, the background, the actual shadows and the definition of the shells themselves, the right hand quayside building, the actual ferry boat as well, and these reflections, beautiful reflections on this lovely sunny day, a few little sparkles showing through, waves lapping against the waterline of the harbour side. We've got just in front of the boat. How are we going to do that? Are we going to reach for the white paint, or are we going to leave that little bit there unpainted? Actually, just see as you zoom in, you can just begin to see the shape of it. And also it does come in just a little bit there. So all of this is dark, but nice bit of light there on that wave. So before I dive into the painting, I look at my source subject, whether I'm painting outdoors, plein air, or looking at this Bronwyn's photograph here, and just take a few minutes thinking about how I'm going to approach it, the steps or stages, my process that I'm going to go through, where am I going to start, where am I going to finish, also trying to observe the values on the painting, where are the lights, where are the darks? Well, obviously the lighter areas are the waves, the tops of the pavilions, that lighter area there. A little bit of light on some of these shells as well. A very light sky. Notice the sky is a tiny bit darker at the top and a little bit lighter coming down towards the horizon. And then next, trying to think about the colours. What colours are we going to use for the different parts of the painting? Some are more obvious than others. Well, this ferry boat, that's a sort of yellow ochre, if I could describe that. A sort of coolish yellow. We've got the red, like a sort of terracotta red of that rooftop. But then the opera house itself, what colour can we see in there with these the cladding on the top of these concrete shells? Beautiful building. It's actually quite old, this building as well. It looks so modern now. When it was built, I think in the late 50s, early 60s, but it looks fantastically modern and contemporary right now. I think a bit of a shame here against that modern building, but I think actually the photograph is making them appear too close to each other. I think actually they're quite a distance apart. But a beautiful building, trying to do it justice. And as I said, I do need to spend a little bit of time getting that building right. Also think about the angles as well, a bit of perspective, and thinking about the placement of the horizon, and that we've got a horizontal line there. This water line, this water's edge does come down ever so slightly, top left to bottom right. That's almost horizontal. That is almost parallel to that. Top of the boat, horizontal. And the building on the right-hand side, obviously a vertical edge there, but then trying to get the perspective right of the different layers of that building. So that's my initial analysis, trying to do justice to this scene of Sydney Opera House. Let's see how we get on. First step then is the drawing, and I'm using, for this painting, I'm using Saunders Waterford cold press paper. This is medium texture, not too rough, not too smooth, right in the middle. It's 300 grams in weight, 140 pounds, and the size of paper 15 inches across by 11 inches down. Now, I don't think it's very easy to dive straight in and paint freehand a wonderful building like the Opera House. So I've got to do an initial drawing, and I've got to make sure these spherical shells are just right before attempting any painting. And that's why I've started drawing that first. I've in my mind, I've tried to imagine the placement of these three main shell shapes sort of in the middle of the composition. And I'm mindful also of the ferry boat as well, positioned as it is in the image. I think it's just right, that image, just where the boat is, that light, as I said, that light against the darker background. And then very gently on this larger shell, very gently trying to get that right-hand curve right. Then there's a lower curve at the back, some straight edges along the base of these spheres, just very simple apex openings, and another gentle curve here, and then there's one behind, which I'm not sure if that's the second group of buildings behind this main one here, and then a lower one here, which I think is the third of the group of buildings, the smallest one. Right, there's a bit of a curve there, slightly shallower angle opening at the base of that shell there, and then it kind of goes into, over to the right, goes into the quayside building. Now the placement of the top, starting with the top of the ferry boat, and there's just a gentle curve, mainly horizontal, but just a bit of a curve, and then also the front of the boat is gently curved down to the top of the hull, and it's got these layers to it as well. There's about 3 or 4 different levels to the main structure of the ferry boat. The actual bow of the boat is, not strictly speaking, a point. It looks like it's fairly flat. I guess that's where people embark, disembark. That level there that's jutting out to the stern, and then the lower level in line with the top level, the back of the ferry boat, and then the top of the hull is almost horizontal, but the waterline is sloping slightly top left to bottom right, just ever so slightly there. And I haven't drawn in a straight line. I want there to be some gentle waves. The background now behind the ferry and the quayside, to this side of the Opera House. There's a little bit of a slope there, but the back, the actual building is right there in the distance, I guess on the other side of the harbour. They're horizontal, but I'll just do the quayside first of all. And this is the harbour wall just below the quayside building. Sorry, I don't know the name of this building. It's on, I think it's Macquarie. I looked on the map. It's Macquarie, if I pronounce that right, Macquarie Street. And it's full of restaurants and shops. I guess a bit like a little shopping mall, is it, for any locals there? There's a nice building here which sort of looks out of place. It's got this very traditional roof with gables, and it's that red colour against the cooler blues of the background. A nice bit of light again against the darker background of the Opera House. Strengthen those lines there. The top of the ferry. Sorry, it's not a boat, it's a ferry. And that flattish bow, the stern. Now continuing on the far side of the harbour, horizontal water's edge, then the outline, the skyline of the buildings in the background. Not too sure whether to have them hit the same level as the top of the ferry, but they are. In the photograph, it is that sort of level. So I'm not going to, I could have made them a little bit shorter, a little bit higher, just so that it's not in line. I don't like different objects all in line. I think sometimes it looks a little bit odd from a composition point of view. From a design point of view, having them sort of all in line like that. So as I say, it's very important to get that drawing right. For me, I just couldn't attempt to do justice to those shells just by cracking on in there and painting away. So I've got to get those shell shapes right. Now the sky is going to be a nice smooth wash, hopefully. And to help that, I'm pre-wetting all of the paper. So I'm using a mop brush here, a soft mop brush, just to lay down an even layer of clear water over the top portion of the painting, over the edges of the buildings and the opera house. And just let it soak in a bit into the paper so it's nice and damp. And as it's not too, as the paper, so it is steadily drying, but as the paper is still fairly damp, hasn't dried, I'm going to start laying in I'm painting in a bottom layer of yellow ochre here. Just a weak wash of yellow ochre that I sense there's a little bit of yellow on the horizon. So that's that over the opera house. And then immediately above that, put in a layer of blue. And this needs to be a bit more intense, a bit stronger in the top left corner, but come weaker as I paint down the scene towards the yellow ochre. And also, because the sun is coming from the right-hand side, make it a bit stronger, a bit darker in the top left corner. So that's why I'm painting at a slight angle. And you can see there how damp the paper is. There's a slight slope on the board as well, which is assisting the blending of that blue with the yellow. It's just gently coming down the page, and I'll just let that do its own thing. Let gravity bring that down a bit. There we are. I'm laying in another coating of darker blue in the top there. I don't want to overdo it. Start with that darker colour in the top left corner and then bring it down with those diagonal strokes down to the lighter area of the sky, and then just leave it. Should go through the my palette here. So from the top, I mean my palette hasn't changed in 20, 30, 40 years. Neutral tint at the, before I go to the colours here, trying to get in the right colour of the front of the ferry boat. It's a sort of, well, again, it's almost like pure yellow ochre. So put that on. Probably a little bit dark, too dark at the moment, a bit too thick, but I can water that down. Anyway, back to the palette. Neutral tint at the top, and then burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, which I'm using now, viridian green, cobalt green, that's going to feature in the water, and cerulean blue, which I use part of that for the sky, cobalt blue, again I use part of that for the sky, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, Windsor red, light red, cadmium orange, lemon yellow. So I don't need to be, the way I'm doing it, I don't need to be too careful with this yellow ochre of the ferry boat going over the edges, but I do need to make sure it's correct, the value is correct on the front part, because that's going to be left unpainted. That will be my light area against the darker background. Now, C. I'm going to start with the start of the back, come forward, come down the page, leave a little bit of paper unpainted for the back of the boat where the water, there's a bit of water being churned up. There you are, just a bit of a ragged edge, and then continue on down probably about the same sort of value. Looking at the photograph, it's a similar value all the way down. I could have gone a bit lighter actually, coming down a tiny bit. Looks a little bit darker in the background, but not very much difference in values between the background water and the foreground water. There's that little bit on the harbour edge, just on the other side of just to the side of the Opera House, and then come all the way down underneath the boat. Take it right across the page, horizontal strokes. I've left a little bit of the paper again unpainted just at the front of the boat. That's where the water's breaking. There's a bit of the wake being created there, and just now keep making these strokes in a horizontal direction, again with that slight slope. It's just moving ever so slightly, and while it's damp I can also just break up the monotony of the value with just some darker, thicker marks. Now, timing is important here, because if I did it too soon, or if the paper was too wet or too dry, I wouldn't get any soft edges to these, and these probably won't show up too much. There'll be quite subtle areas of darkness in that foreground sea, which, as the watercolor dries lighter, it is. So that's the thing with watercolor. It always, well, most of the time it does dry lighter, and we probably won't notice those darker waves, but it's just good to get in a little bit of a subtle change in variation of the tone and some soft edges, which is why I laid that in while it was while the water was the paper was quite damp. So, speeding up the process with a hairdryer, which I'm going to be using quite a lot of in this painting. The way I'm going to be doing the Opera House itself, I will need to use that quite a lot, but here, to speed up the process with a hairdryer, make sure everything is totally dry, particularly around the Opera House itself there. Make sure it's very dry, and the paper, if it's buckled, it will now go flatter. Now that the sea is drier, I'm going to lay down just a few darker waves, just a few darker wave brush marks. I'm using a squirrel mop brush for this, which creates nice elliptical wave shapes when there's not too much water on the brush. So I'm making a darker grayish color, and with the brush, with the shape of that brush head, I can then just very gently touching the paper and in slightly different directions give the impression of some darker waves. You see me just changing the direction slightly, and these marks will be thicker coming towards us, quite thin in the distance. Not too many. I don't want to overdo it, because I will be going in with the reflections, the boat reflections, the quayside building reflection at a later stage. But these are just some underlying gentle waves which are just a shade darker than the water. And with the addition of these, it's just beginning to look a little bit more realistic as water. Just a few there behind the boat. As the brush is getting a little bit drier now, I can make a few in the background. If you want to have a go at projects like this, pop up to my Patreon site, patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. You'll see a very lively watercolor community with watercolor painters from all over the world, and I set monthly projects similar to this for people to get involved in, participate in, and get a critique back from me. And also there's regular live streams as well that we won't have on YouTube, and image sharing. So take a look at that, patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. Very important part of the painting now is painting that first shell of the Opera House. And it doesn't matter if I go over the shell immediately to the right, because that is dark. If you look at the image, the source image, that middle shell is the second shell going over to the right is a good bit darker. Now there are a few ways of approaching this graded wash, where it's this first one is quite light at the top and darker at the bottom. So you could do a graded wash. You could start off quite light and watery, and then as you paint in very gentle horizontal brush marks, you're getting darker and thicker as you come down to the base of that shell. Or my method is to do a little bit of wetting wet, so the paint is quite damp, and as I come down to the base, I'm going to drop in, while it's still damp, drop in darker, thicker colour. So second use of the hairdryer to speed things up, so that I need to make sure that first one is quite dry. Just drop it, it's still a bit damp. I can drop in a bit more in the bottom left corner there. I'm mixing at the top. The colour I'm sensing in the Opera House with these concrete spheres, I can see all sorts of different colours, and of course it's inheriting colours from all the objects around, but mainly blues. I can see a bit of alizarin in there from my palette, tiny bit of yellow ochre as well at the base of some of them. Just using my finger to lift off a tiny bit of colour at the top of that first shell. You can see I can get quite a good edge with a brush like this as well, and then holding it like a pen, I can be quite precise with these lines. And this is going so tight for me. I'm used to painting in more of a loose way, but a building like this, it justifies going tight. And this paint is going to be a mixture of tight and loose. Very tight round here to do justice to this lovely building. I need to make sure it's quite precisely and carefully painted, being, well, it's a focal point of the painting, but I can get a little bit looser elsewhere. Now I need to make sure it's very dry, as I say, before I attempt the next shell in. The other way of doing these individual shells is to paint them individually, but just be very precise when you go up to the edge, not paint over the edge like I'm doing, but just treat them as individual objects. And be very careful not painting over the edge, and then again making sure each shell is dry before you go on to the next one. But because in watercolour we're painting light to dark, this one is going to be quite dark. Where it meets the first shell, I painted that edge is going to be quite dark. And then the tallest one as well, that's got another dark edge against the second shell. Adopting the same method, just dropping a bit of darker colour. Quite complex shadow at the bottom of the first shell at a sort of 45-degree angle, and quite a hard edge to it as well. And I need to dry the second shell before I go on to the next one. Pointing it right at that shell. I'm probably holding the hairdryer maybe a couple of inches above the paper, or what's that, 5-6 centimeters above the paper, so not, of course, not too close, or not too far away. So that should be quite dry now. And then onto the third tallest shell. Similar colour. Start off light at the top. Now, a bit of a challenge with this one is the right hand edge. I need to be very careful and have as steady a hand as I can to get that edge just right. So I'm just orientating my hand to facilitate getting that sweeping curve. Down to and over the adjacent shell. Paint down to the bottom. There's a little bit of yellow ochre which I detected. The more I look at it, the more I can see different colours. And a photograph may not give us the true colours either. There could be, and the monitor, the screen you're looking at this video through, maybe that's distorting the colours as well. So that's why it's always best to be there. To plein air painting, to do this painting there on site would be brilliant. This photograph was taken from another ferry boat, so not from a land-based static location. So quite, as I say, quite an unusual view of this side of the Opera House. You might not be able to see just because a little bit of the glare of the paper, but I'm coming darker now towards the bottom of the shell. Be careful with the left-hand edge. I just spotted a hair coming out my brush there, so I just had to remove that. Back to that left-hand edge. This is just not normal for me, spending so much time on an edge like that. I would just go whoosh and it's done. But as I say, I do need to be careful with particularly these three main shells here to give it that iconic look. Now darken up the right hand edge. And down to the shell that's just below it, where that's just a little bit lighter, that one below it. There's a bit of a shadow going up from the base, almost at a 45-degree angle. Bit of yellow ochre for this lighter one. Bring out the hairdryer again when I want a hard edge or to speed up the process. check the edge of the brush, make sure I've got that flat edge. Just lift off a little bit of the paint with the finger if I think it's if I just put too much down. I think I've just painted around maybe one of the shells of the smaller of the three groups. Now going back to the shell above that, a dark edge again, and the bottom edge. Or just where it's behind this. Hard edge up to the quayside building and over the edge of that building. The quayside building is going to be darker, a shade or two darker than the shells of the opera house, so I can go over those edges and I'll make those disappear at the painting stage. Now dab in a little bit of red for some rooftops in the background. Just a few random marks there. I don't need to be too precise because I'm going to create the roof shapes by painting in darker around those. And I need to make sure that that red is dry before I paint around it. I want a harder edge, so again, to speed up the process and make sure the paper is dry, get out my hairdryer. Just noticed a little bit of paint there. I've lifted off with my index finger. The colour of the background buildings on the left hand side is, how could I describe it? Maybe middle darkness, middle value, quite dark towards the bottom, lighter at the top, darker at the bottom, and just a few little sparkles of rooftop showing. There's a triangular shape of a roof, a red triangle that's, I don't want to make it too obvious because I don't want the viewer's eye going over there. I want the emphasis to be, of course, on the opera house and the ferry boat in front of it, so not too obvious. There's the triangle of the roof. Paint around that and then just continue over. Same brush then, bit of neutral tint, using a bit of lavender, burnt sienna as well. Burnt sienna and lavender, not many manufacturers do lavender. Mine is from Shinhan. And it's a lovely opaque colour to add to burnt sienna, I find, for doing nice backgrounds, background hills, background buildings. Nice combination, I think. And as I come down these background, bit of neutral tint, ultramarine blue, down to the bottom, down to the water's edge, and this is going to be horizontal, this water's edge, but not too straight. And take the background buildings up to the left hand of the ferry boat, drop in a bit of colour in the top there, just to give the impression of some darker recesses or darker buildings in front of lighter buildings. If you want to get involved in some live watercolor workshops, please go to crowdcast.io/Tim Wilmot, and you'll see my program of up and coming live watercolor workshops, basically paint along experiences, not just fairly uninteractive demos that you just watched. I definitely want you to participate and paint along with me, and lots of Q&A along the way. And online we can share each other's photographs, share each other's paintings as well. So if you're interested, go up to crowdcast.io/Tim Wilmot and you'll see all my up and coming events. Now, right hand side, the quayside building that is darker than just a little bit darker than the Opera House, and this needs to be, I believe, painted in a loose way, but I do need to make sure that left hand edge is nice and vertical, so I can go quite loose with this. I don't want it to be painted particularly well. I do want it to be painted well, but not so precisely that the viewer's eye would be taken off the Opera House. I want the emphasis, I want to be the focus to be, of course, on the Opera House and the ferry boat. Go a tiny bit darker towards the base of the building. And then down towards the bottom of the building, there's a few trees, a few sort of lollipop shaped trees, and then a little bit of red from some rooftops that are in the shade. And I have to paint a little bit more carefully around the white pavilions, these white pagodas right on the shoreline. So here's the red. Just a few triangular shapes. There we are, dropping a bit of colour above it, over to the right hand side. And for the trees, bit of lemon yellow, bit of cobalt blue. I just mixed in that spot there and drop in just a few blobs of green. So that will just give the impression that there's something in there. In the photograph, they are actually catching quite a bit of light, but I'll just have them as a single bit of single value of green. The bottom of the Opera House is going to give me a hard edge against the ferry boat and a bit of opportunity to have that contrast which attracted me to this scene, particularly that level there where I'm painting, where it's quite light against the structure of the ferry boat. Now this is angled slightly down. There are a few darker triangles above this band that I'm painting here. And I do need to leave a line unpainted, which is the key side hitting the light. So that's that darker area, and paint around a few extra pavilions, pagodas at the edge of the quay. And now the harbour wall itself, leaving that lighter area above it. Drop in a bit of darker colour here and there in that just below just in the base of the Opera House. Rooftop of this building on the water's edge. Just a bit of light red and red. While that's drying, I can paint in the ferry boat, starting from the top, just below the top of the ferry boat. I have a touch of light hitting the top of it, be light against the darker background of the ferry boat. An important hard edge there of the shadow against the lighter part of the structure of the ferry boat, and then next layer down, leave a bit of light at the back, come towards the front, and again have a bit of an angle for the shadow, and then next level down, ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, bit of neutral tint. I think it does go a tiny bit darker, the bottom of this boat. So this lower level, just above the hull, bring it round to the front. dry this roof, that red rooftop, before I paint the actual harbour side itself. So a bit of water. So burnt sienna, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, sorry, a bit of red, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, red, neutral tint, burnt sienna. Keep mixing. For this harbour wall, it's a bit darker than, I've gone a bit darker than the harbour wall behind, just below the Opera House. And now I need to paint underneath these pavilions and down to the water's edge. Define the building here on the water's edge with the apex of the roof and that gable there. Keep mixing up different colours as I go through this area. Underneath the next row of pavilions, not a straight edge, just keep them all a little bit different. Keep mixing in different intensities of colour down to the water's edge. Like the back of the harbour, I'm not going to have a straight edge for the water line itself, the actual water's edge. Just have a few little indents and bumps and curves where we can just see that I'm going to have a few little waves showing there. Perhaps there's a bit of turbulence from these ferry boats going backwards and forwards. Again, just dropping a bit of colour, a bit of darker values into that area. So first darker area of reflections, mainly cobalt green, a bit of burnt sienna. I could have actually mixed up a bit of viridian green, that might have worked quite well. A sort of 2/3 viridian green and a little bit of burnt sienna, that might have given again a similar sort of colour that I wanted. Now there's not too many reflections on the left hand side of the harbour wall, but they become stronger. Just they're catching a little bit of the Opera House, but mainly this quayside building. So starting at the water's edge, and it doesn't matter if these reflections just bleed into the harbour wall, that doesn't matter. Leave a few little bits of paper unpainted where those waves are lapping against the harbour wall, and then come down with these little, like I was doing before at the earlier stage, just a few little elliptical shapes in a horizontal direction, pressing quite softly on the paper and a bit more erratic as they come down to the foreground and thicker those brush marks thicker as well. Less gaps between these waves in the distance, more gaps and thicker gaps towards us. Check the angle, check the shape of the brush, keep going over the edge of the paper. When I peel off that masking tape, it will give us a nice crisp white edge, so I want to take the paint over there, and you can see I'm just adjusting the way I'm doing it, just adjusting the angle of the brush ever so slightly, pointing up, pointing down. Cover up a few of those more distant gaps in the waves, down to the bottom. Lift off a little bit with the finger if I've seen there's too much paint on the paper. I can also lift off a little bit with a tissue to introduce some lighter areas and a little bit of that lighter area reflected in the water. Back to the ferry and the hull of the ferry. This is quite dark. This is one of the darker parts of the painting, apart from the recess underneath the shells of the opera house. But this is quite dark, and start from the back of the boat, back of the ferry boat. Starting from the top of the hull down to the water line, and keep that. I don't want a straight waterline. I'll introduce a little bit of a lighter area for the wake. A few little waves. Right hand side of the bow. Mix in a bit of Viridian green for the front of this ferry. Continue on down to the waterline and just make sure the edge is looking as good as I can, and paint around that little bit of breaking wave at the front of the ferry. Now reflections of the ferry, cobalt green, a little bit of Viridian green. Start from the back of the ferry, a few very thin, faint lines, but now get a bit stronger towards the reflection of the ferry itself. And the dark paint from the ferry is just blending in a little bit to my reflections, which doesn't matter. Painting around a little bit of the waves around the waterline up to the front. There's just a few little darker waves between the ferry and between the ferry reflection and the quayside building reflection. Check the point of the brush, make sure I've got that edge for making these wave shapes, and then continue down to the bottom. Like the reflection of the big building, I've got thinner waves in the distance, make them wider, fatter, coming down towards me, more gaps between them as well, bit more erratic in shape. Down to the bottom, just a few darker ones over there on the left hand side. Just a few. Perhaps a little bit of a few little lines in this gap here to break that up. The next stage of the painting is now adding in some of the darkest darks and finer details of, well, the boat, the ferry, the building. On the right hand side, I need to get in the layers, the levels of that building. So first, a bit of definition of the top of the ferry boat. I'm using a small synthetic brush for this. So that's the darker area underneath that second shell. Up to the bigger shell. Unfortunately, at this stage, I can't easily see the pencil lines where I'd drawn these bottom recesses, these bottom openings. So I'm just trying to look at the photograph and just go for it, basically. Need to continue this all the way over to the building, and then this darker area blends into the base of the taller building. In the photograph, it's sort of hidden by the canopy of trees and the lower level of the building. create some definition now to the top of that red building and the opening underneath this right-hand shell. Take that into the building. Fill in between the two, come down to the top of the red rooftop. Careful edge here, almost horizontal. I suppose that would be, it'd be almost horizontal. I would assume that's at eye level there, into the building, and when I put in the layers of the building, I'll tidy that up a bit, lift off a bit with the fingers if I think there's a little bit too much paint there. A slightly bigger synthetic brush now for the building, the layers of the building, but a similar colour, the similar sort of darks that I was using just now. Whatever's in the palette doesn't really to be too important. Mostly neutral tint to get these darker bands. Now I haven't drawn in. Ideally, I should have drawn in these lines here because this with the perspective, I need to get this absolutely right. So a bit steeper at the top and then coming a little bit more horizontal towards the bottom of the building. And these are these balconies of this building. All the way down to the canopy, make those a little bit steeper. And on the left-hand side, jutting out on the left-hand side of the building, just to give a hint of a little bit of a balcony. And then in between those darker bands, we're going to have a few, I think they're windows or darker recesses, to give a hint of give a hint of what's just immediately behind the balcony. Just a few of them. Again, I haven't drawn these in. I might have actually drawn those in just to be absolutely sure, make it a little bit easier at this stage to be a bit more precise with the placement of these windows. But this side is going to be fairly loose, and also I need to. There are a few faint, when you squint your eyes, there are a few faint vertical lines as well. Top of the harbour wall, just below those pavilions. Back to the smaller brush. Windows, could have drawn those in as well. I didn't, so I'm just really going in freehand here. I think there's five windows at the top. I'll just sort of, that looks about right. Define that next level down a tiny bit, and then some windows on the next level. I've got space for about 4 again. Might have got that wrong. I think there's 5 in the photo, but doesn't really, it's not important. A few windows on that level. Just above the hull there's some darker areas, windows, and then a few more at the front again. And let's have a line going along the hull, maybe something at the water line as well, just a little bit. I'm using my finger again just to smudge in things, just to work things in a little bit. That little building, bottom of the roof, some vertical supports. Right on top of the ferry boat there's some, I guess, some sonar equipment, maybe a flag, tiny mast. Just create the impression of that. Tidy up some of these balconies. Just the edge, just where it's jutting out into the sky there. This is a final little bit of darker, I think this is a darker recess maybe of one of the shells, one of the openings. I don't think it's another shell, dark shell itself. Paint over a few little areas that I might have missed, just to cover up some of those lighter areas. I'm applying a little bit of a lighter area to that, the waves behind that boat, and then just tone down these side waves as well. They're a bit too bright. Few darker waves just in there where perhaps it's a bit of a shadow being cast by the boat on the water. Just make them a little bit darker. So I'm picking up there lots of different dark colours, not just pure neutral tint, which would make it a bit too black. I need to introduce some subtle blend of colours. So I tend to just pick up some of the darker colours for these darks here from my palette, the alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, burnt umber, neutral tint. My brush now is actually quite dry. You can just see that as I'm making these vertical marks, I'm not actually making much of an impression on the paper. Just a few gentle marks there. Another mast or two on the ferry. I could actually use some white paint here to drop in a few extra lights. The more I look at the photograph, I detect some street lights and some extra vertical objects that are just catching the light. There's a lighter line over the bow of the boat that's just catching a bit of light. I'll resist that. I'll see if I can complete this. A little challenge, trying to complete the painting without using any white paint. Tiny bit of shadow on the left-hand side of some of these pavilions. Just a tiny bit. I want to try and keep that area quite bright. Now I've got quite a few pencil marks showing on the lighter areas, on the white areas of the pavilion. So because the paint is still quite wet around there, before I rub out, I like to, where I do see too many pencil marks, to try and regain that crisp edge between the white paper and a dark area around it. Rub it out, but I need to make sure it's totally dry first of all. So last time with the hairdryer then, making sure that is dry before I reach for my rubber or razor and just gently lift off that front wave there in front of the boat as well. Just brush that off. There we are. So I always like to give myself a little bit of a debrief, a little bit of a critique at the end of the painting, just to try and spend a few moments thinking about what went okay, what maybe could be improved next time I do something similar to this. I really would, if I did make a hash of it, I rarely actually do the whole painting another time. I tend to pick maybe a very similar scene, but then try and pick up the lessons I'd learnt from the prior painting. But just to analyse this one, so Sydney Opera House, a little bit of tight painting for me, but then a mixture of loose watercolor techniques as well. From a composition point of view, I was quite happy with that, with the placement of the actual opera house building, these cantilever shells there, and the ferry boat coming into the ferry station with that light, that crisp edge that nice edge there, and also creating a bit of contrast. The light bit, the light front of the ferry boat, and against the darker background of the opera house. It was also a good chance to go through reflections again, and important to, I think, use a quill mop brush or mop brush to get in some of these wave marks that we've got, and that sort of zigzaggy approach, a slight angle there and a slight angle there and a slight angle there, a slight angle here, and connecting some of these shapes as well. So let's just come over here, this area here, connecting all of that the way that I did this mark, and connecting them all together gives hopefully a slightly more realistic approach to it. And then the actual quayside building, fairly, see if I can zoom in a bit more, fairly loose on that one. I didn't draw in those balconies. I could have done to maybe make them a little bit more precise, but I think I got away with it with the angles there. And background, let's go into the background over here. The background of the harbour, which was fairly horizontal. I think I got the value about right. Darker, slightly darker at the bottom, and then not a perfect, no perfection in the edge of the waterline there, and the actual ferry boat itself. I'm not sure what the focal point would be in this, whether it is and maybe quite rightly so, the actual shells, the cantilever shells of the opera house, or whether it's that ferry boat. But for me, that contrast between the lighter part of the ferry boat and the darker background looks quite nice in watercolor. And then these lighter canopies as well, these lighter pavilions against the darker background. There we are, Sydney Opera House. Catch up with you on the next video.